When it comes to trade relations, the future of the North American economy is at stake. Last week, the highly anticipated lead-up to next year's review of CUSMA has started. The Prime Minister kicked it off by traveling to Mexico last week for a summit without America. Mark Carney and his Mexican counterpart, Claudia Sheinbaum, signed an agreement aimed at deepening trade and investment between the two countries. CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement on Free Trade, or in the U.S., United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, often saw Ottawa and Washington taking public swipes at each other. Last week, the American ambassador to Canada called Ottawa's Elbows Up campaign anti-American, but is hopeful a new trade deal will be reached.
I'm not talking about Canadian or American politicians, but sometimes politicians do the wrong thing. Okay? I hope that this is not one of those cases. I am optimistic about the future because I look at the past, all right? And so many people have benefited on both sides of the border in terms of prosperity, security, stability, and all of these types of things.
Joining us now is international trade expert John Biscarial. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you today, Ben.
Okay, so we are in the lead up to next year's review of the North American trade deal. Talk to me about how crucial this period is that we're in right now.
Well, this is critical for Canadians and Canadian industry and Canadian workers. The negotiation of the free trade agreement back in the 1980s was probably the most significant economic event in Canadian modern history. And since that time, the NAFTA, as it became, and then now the CUSMA, has been a critical tool for Canadian businesses in terms of our access to the US market, in terms of prosperity, really, here in Canada. And so now that we're going through this exercise of reviewing it and possibly amending and renegotiating its terms, this is indeed a critical time for Canadians and actually for American and Mexican businesses as well.
You know, a lot of people assume that if they don't see any work happening, no work is actually being done. So let's dispel that right now. What is happening behind the scenes during this time?
Well, right now, all three countries, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, have initiated public consultations. So they will be getting comments from industry, NGOs, other interest groups on what's working with the CUSMA and what's not working, and what things need to be changed. Notwithstanding that, you can already expect that the negotiators in the governments of each of the three countries have already been thinking long and hard about what they want to see changed, perhaps what they want to defend in the upcoming negotiations. And so a lot of that's much of what's going on behind the scenes. But it's an important point you raised, Ben, because we shouldn't not only be focusing on these upcoming negotiations, but the Canadian government is also negotiating some kind of trade arrangement, hopefully to deal with the tariffs we're facing right now from the United States. So those IEEPA tariffs, those reciprocal tariffs, the sectoral tariffs that are targeting auto, steel, aluminum, and copper right now. They're set to target other industries as well. Those are separate negotiations that are going on, and hopefully even before we get into the review of NAFTA, we're going to see some kind of deal on that.
Now, as far as the bigger picture of the North American economy is, what's at stake?
Well, I think you can look at this in a number of ways. I think from the perspective of Canadian producers and exporters, the U.S. Is obviously our most important customer and has been for many, many years. As I mentioned earlier, we've been integrating supply chains with the United States now for decades. We've started to do that with Mexico as well, but certainly the relationship with the United States is critical for Canadian business, and having access to that US market on a duty-free basis is very important for Canadian industry. Now, we are obviously facing a huge hurdle in the positions that the Trump administration has taken. In particular, his threats of tariffs, the current tariffs that are targeting steel, aluminum, and autos, copper as well. And so at the same time, while we're all focused on dealing with those threats in terms of our access to the US market, I think we also need to think about diversifying. And already we've seen Prime Minister Carney, obviously, this week visiting Mexico, trying to mend ties with Mexico to increase opportunities there. But also, the government, I expect, is looking at encouraging businesses to diversify into other markets, the UK, the EU, Asia, even China.
John, you said earlier that the governments have been engaged in public consultations. And I suppose in your own way, with your own clients, you're getting your own version of that. You're hearing from your clients as to what they hope comes out of these, what their reaction is to this instability. What have they told you?
Well, I think at the top of that list is certainty.
Yeah.
So what we've learned, obviously, in this year, in the last 7 or 8 months, is that that loss of certainty is hugely damaging to us in the Canadian economy. With this tariff threat, and sometimes it's an on and off tariff threat. Sometimes we think we're going to be facing 35% tariffs, and then Trump draws back a bit and makes concessions. That back and forth is really damaging to the business environment. And so I do think, at least from the Canadian perspective, one of the things we're going to be looking for in this renegotiation, we're obviously going to be resisting efforts by the US to make things more difficult to access the US market, which they will be doing as part of their review of CUSMA and the possible renegotiation. We're also going to be looking at getting some assurances that, for example, the Section 232 national security tariffs can't be imposed upon a whim on our aluminum and steel industries or our automotive industries. Perhaps some stricter standards or handcuffs on the US on their ability to impose these tariffs. And that would apply to any member of the CUSMA region. That, of course, is going to be a very big challenge with this Trump administration.
Yeah, well, the president has said himself he loves tariffs and he loves having that power, which you could argue he took, but he has that power and he's been wielding that power. So the question is, will these negotiations lead to somehow him willingly circumscribing his own power? And that's a question that's up for grabs. But let's move on to the U.S. ambassador to Canada. He called Ottawa's Elbows Up campaign anti-American. And I've got to ask, as somebody who's been paying attention to this for a long time, have you ever seen such public attacks between Ottawa and Washington before?
In short, no, this is unprecedented. I'm not quite sure I'd characterize Elbows Up as being anti-American. It certainly is defensive, and it's something probably most Canadians would agree we had to do to deal with the tariff threat. But at this time, there's a positive way of looking at this. And obviously, certain of our industries are suffering right now, and I don't want to minimize any of that suffering in those sectors. But this is forcing us to look at other trading countries. It's forcing us to look harder at the EU, the UK. It's forcing us to look harder at Japan and other countries as possible trading partners. Right now, the vast majority of our trade, and therefore of our exports and GDP, is focused on the United States. And although what Trump has done is really threatened Canadian businesses in a very significant way, it's also forcing us as a country, it's forcing the business community to look very hard at other alternatives in terms of diversifying. Unfortunately, that can't be done on a dime. We can't turn on a dime and change that. But that process, I think, with a number of businesses has already started, where they're looking at customers, suppliers, extending their supply chain to other countries other than the United States.
Last question for you, sir. How do you see these trade negotiations playing out next year? I'm essentially asking you to pull out your crystal ball.
I don't think we're going to get rid of the CUSMA. And I know that in and of itself may be a controversial statement, because many have talked about the possibility of Trump withdrawing from the CUSMA entirely. And there'll be legal issues around that as to whether he has the authority to do that in the US, whether Congress has to be part of that. The courts in the US could come into play on that. But putting all of that aside, I do think CUSMA will continue. It may be a very different agreement, however, and that's really where the meat of this is going to be. To what extent are we going to see things like rules of origin, which dictate how much US content or Canadian content or Mexican content must be in a product for it to enter the market duty-free? Those types of things, and that's really where the devil is in the details. That's where we're probably going to see some changing. We're probably going to see some tightening of those rules, which may make it more difficult for Canadian products to access the US market. But at the end of the day, I'm fairly confident that we're still going to have a CUSMA in place next year and for the years to come.
John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ben. It was a pleasure.